When I think of the first Star Wars games that I ever played, 3 specifically come to mind, and those are Rogue Squadron on the N64, the Phantom Menace video game on PC, and Star Wars Dark Forces. There were other games like X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, Rebellion, Jedi Power Battles, Racer. All of these games I remember very vividly, but none of them stood out like the first 3 that I mentioned. And the first 2 Dark Forces games were games that I so clearly remember playing when I was quite literally 3 or 4 years old. Now, granted, I do remember Dark Forces 2 more clearly, but I credit that with the fact you could use lightsabers and you could go into third person. It was just a more memorable game in a childhood sense. But that doesn't change the fact that Dark Forces was also a staple part of my childhood. And thanks to the guys over at Night Dive Studios, this iconic Star Wars classic is back, sporting brand new visuals which improves many of the game's assets, quality of life improvements to the gameplay itself, and a swath of bonus content. And I got the opportunity to play the Dark Forces Remaster early, and in this video I'm going to give you an honest review in regards to the gameplay, its visuals, its general improvements and more, which will hopefully give you a fair assessment as to whether this is a game you should purchase. Now, I played this game on PC, so I'm reviewing it for the PC, but the Dark Forces Remaster will be available for pretty much every single platform. So let's get into it. So for those of you that don't know, this is a remaster of the 1995 classic Star Wars first-person shooter Dark Forces. It's the first ever outing of Kyle Katarn as he steals the Death Star plans and is then tasked with uncovering an insidious plot by the Empire and Imperial officer Ron Mock to create these terrifying machines known as Dark Troopers. And if you're a fan of The Mandalorian, this is where the Dark Troopers originally come from. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you and say narratively this game isn't anything special by today's standards. The story of Kyle Katarn and the reason why so many people love him was more so because of the sequel and the sequels beyond that. But Dark Forces lays the foundation for the Jedi Knight series that is so beloved and widely regarded as some of the best Star Wars games to ever exist. But I just want to make sure for people that haven't played the game, you don't go into this with the expectation that you're going to get any kind of high-octane, intense, character-driven, first-person Star Wars story. But with that said, there is absolutely a story here, and one that is entertaining, but it is a basic one. There isn't a crazy amount of character development for Kyle Katarn or his partner Jan Ors, and the same can be said for the villain and the side characters. But back in 1995, nearly 30 years ago, it was impressive just to include these kind of narrative elements. Most first-person shooters 30 years ago were just about running around shooting things in a level and then doing it again. There were very few first-person shooters in the marketplace that did what Dark Forces did, and that was include a heavy emphasis on its narrative elements such as fully voiced cutscenes, character dialogue and interaction during the levels, and staging for each level that included story elements. Dark Forces 2 then took this a lot further with an even heavier emphasis on character development, their motivations, live action cutscenes which still look good today, branching storylines, player choice, you name it. And the real focus of the original Dark Forces was being able to weave those narrative elements within its level design and its fun first-person shooter gameplay, and of course its implementation of new technologies and its challenge. You must remember this game was released at a time when first-person shooters were truly in their infancy, with things like Wolfenstein and Doom leading the charge, and it was a kind of test to see if Star Wars could be implemented into that same genre. And what you're getting here with the Dark Forces Remaster is exactly that, a remaster. This game feels like it's from the 90s, it plays like it's from the 90s, it's written like it's from the 90s, it looks like it's from the 90s, albeit stylistically, and that's okay. The Dark Forces remaster isn't trying to be anything other than Dark Forces from the 90s. And in an age of remakes, the Dark Forces remaster is a fresh breath of air and stays true to giving you the same experience people had with this game 30 years ago, but with a vastly improved visual quality and some general quality of life improvements. But let's talk about the actual gameplay of Dark Forces. I don't think enough people in the games industry give Dark Forces enough credit for how well it improved the first-person shooter space, because at the very least it was one of the first games to vastly improve upon a lot of the mechanics that prior top-tier FPS games like Doom had established. Its implementation of more narrative-based level design, which included plot-driven mission structure and objectives, and because of the uniqueness of the engine that was built for this game, the levels were a lot more immersive by adding verticality. Rooms inside of rooms, on top of rooms, below rooms, and this gave the level structure much more fluidity in terms of making it feel like it was an actual place, rather than just, rooms of enemies to kill. You have the option to look up and down, you can jump and crouch, and it also implemented things like dynamic lighting. When you would shoot blasters in a dark room, it would light up, and as you can see here, there's levels with entire waterways that lead into the sewers, that go down, and the deeper you get into the sewers, the darker it gets, but you can then climb up, and you can slowly get into rooms that allow you to open doors in the sewers to proceed through the level. And level design like this was unprecedented at the time, and it's actually really fun to go back and look at how these games were made, and to be able to experience the kind of early days of level design and how they evolved over the years, especially in regard to first-person shooters. As I mentioned, there's also objective-based things you can do in these levels too, such as finding keycards and just loot. You would then have to go into your inventory and read the keycards, which would then help you solve puzzles. And there are even very archaic platforming elements, some where you would actually need to adjust structures on the map to be able to proceed, such as this section where you have to shoot the lights, which adjusts the flooring behind you, allowing you to proceed further up. Although that's more like a puzzle than platforming, I guess. But things like this just added more dynamism to the game, more gameplay options, more things to do. You aren't just running around shooting enemies as much as you were navigating these spaces and figuring out how you needed to proceed through them. There was even some dynamic environments as well, where you could shoot blasters off of the wall and it would ricochet around the entire room. There would be areas where you can blow up walls to find hidden objectives. It was just very unique and very different for the time. But with that said, there is a challenge in finding your way around these maps, and that challenge can sometimes turn to frustration. The actual map that helps you navigate the levels is still diabolical, and I felt that way 25 years ago when I first played the game. It's this really simplistic line map that just does not help you find your way around at all. And when it comes to finding hidden entrances and the right enemies for loot drops, if you haven't experienced this game before and intend to play it without any kind of guide, it will test your patience at times, because unlike modern games, which always have a pointer, even if it's just a directional aid, this game does not. However, that isn't a criticism of this remaster, that is a general criticism of the game from 30 years ago. Another great element of Dark Forces gameplay though is its gunplay. It's very fast paced and it gives you lots of weapon diversity, from basic E11 blasters, the iconic Kyle Katarn Briar pistol, to crazy things like mortar launchers and plasma guns. And to add to that, a lot of these weapons even have secondary fire, which gives you a variety of ways to tackle every obstacle in the game, and it also keeps almost every level exciting and fresh. And the great thing is, the remaster gives you little quality of life changes to the gameplay that help improve its stability, making it feel less archaic than it really is. For example, in the original Dark Forces, looking up and down wasn't mapped to your mouse like a modern first-person shooter, whereas this remaster gives you total aiming control, making it feel like a more modern FPS. But with that said though, there is still elements of the old school auto auto-aiming experience, where the bolts will kind of just drag themselves to the enemy regardless of where you're aiming, and this seems to be random when this happens. Sometimes the bolts will auto-aim, sometimes they won't, which takes a little bit of time to get used to, but it's not detracting from the gameplay experience. This was done back then because with the fast-natured combat, precision shooting wasn't easy, so there was a system that gave you a little bit of leeway. I wonder if they maybe could have removed it for this remaster, or at the very least gave you the option, especially given that you do now have total control over the aiming, and so the need for that heavy auto-aim isn't really necessary, but alas. Night Dives also implemented things like the removal of the head bobbing, which I know some people would find very frustrating, as well as reticle customization and full controller support, but as I mentioned, these are more quality of life changes rather than systemic gameplay changes that make it feel any different. Outside of being able to aim more freely, the gameplay at its core is identical to the 1995 version. So with the remaster, it still very much feels like a shooter from the 1990s, just refined to make it a more seamless gameplay experience in 2024. Now, as for the performance of the Dark Forces remaster, when you are remastering a game of this age without significantly changing its framework, I think a lot of people might have concerns that maybe it might be stuttery or laggy, or it runs poorly or buggy, but in all honesty, I actually found no issues with the general performance of the game. Not only was the frame rate seamless, running at 120 FPS, there wasn't an instance in this game where the frame rate dropped or I felt like it was stuttering. And so in regard to the way it feels and the way it runs on a technical level, it was actually an almost perfect experience. However, there was one thing that does bring it down, and that was the hard crashing. The game has an inventory system called the PDA where you can read your mission objectives and look at the things you've picked up, and at times the PDA is essential because you need to look at the things you picked up to solve certain puzzles. But the game would hard crash every now and then when going into the PDA, and I say every now and then, but it was actually around 7 times across my playthrough. And what made this even more frustrating is because there's no system of saving where you can checkpoint in a level, leave the game and come back, which, by the way, is a very strange omission. If your game crashed, you would have to start the level from the beginning. And so it actually got to the point where I was a little bit anxious opening the PDA just in case it happened, because there was no real consistency as to why it was crashing. It would just crash if I opened it. But Night Dive are at least aware of it, and so are you. Now, of course, let's talk about the thing that you're all here for, let's be honest, and that is the visual presentation of the game. The key thing to keep in mind with the Dark Forces remaster is that it's not a remake, it's not a reboot or a reimagining, it is simply a remaster. And I have to say, on a visual level, it is a phenomenal remaster. They have managed to keep the visual tone of the game while upgrading so many of the assets, such as the in-game sprites with beautiful modern 4K designs, the environments are improved upon significantly, the textures are so much better, the lighting is improved, the skyboxes are improved, the weapon models look fantastic, the cutscenes are beyond incredible, which I will talk about in a minute, and quite literally everything in this game on a visual level is just splendid. And what makes everything so much better is they haven't changed the tone of the game in any way. Even though it is 4K and all of the textures and all of the models and the sprites just look so much better, it still looks like a game from the 90s. The only way I can describe this remaster is that it looks how my 5-year-old self remembers it, if that makes sense. I honestly can't praise Night Dive enough for just how fabulous this game is artistically. And my only real criticism with the game visually is maybe some of the 3D models. Dark Forces was one of the first games to implement 3D models into a 2D space, and back in the day they used to call it 2.5D. However, the 3D specific models in this game, at least most of them, aren't touched upon in any way, shape or form. Whereas a lot of the character sprites, the assets, the weapons, and a lot of the environmental work, it's all brand new. So I'm a little bit confused as to why they didn't do that for some of the 3D models as well, because against the backdrops and the quality of everything else in this remaster, the 3D models stand out as being quite terrible and visually out of place. In fact, they are literally just textureless polygons. Now, of course, there may be technical limitations here as to why they couldn't implement new models. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm some expert on old game engines, but I felt like it was a fair thing to point out, as it is the only thing that kind of brings down the visual splendor of what they've built here. A great example of this is towards the end of the game, I ran into this Imperial shuttle, and I genuinely thought maybe it was bugged because it looked really, really bad, which actually leads me directly to my next point, which is the cutscenes. The cutscenes were completely rebuilt for the Dark Forces remaster, and they are amazing. Instead of just upscaling them, which they could have done, whether it's the 3D cutscenes or the 2D cutscenes, they are rebuilt from the ground up artistically. They are one of the most standout parts of the game on a visual level, and they look phenomenal. And again, it's the way they managed to balance these newly rebuilt cutscenes to look so fresh and so brand new, while also making them feel like they were from 1995, and to me that's just awesome. And so, like I said, it confuses me that they have all of these beautiful 3D models for the cutscenes, and I just lack a bit of understanding as to why they couldn't implement those few into the actual game. There's also some visual quality of life improvements, such as the option to get rid of the HUD. I know most of you won't care about that, but there will be some of you that like removing HUDs from video games. I love to remove HUDs, I just don't like them. On top of that, you also have the instantaneous ability to flip the game's visuals from the remaster to the original Dark Forces. This was actually a feature that was quite common in remasters from the early 2010s. I'm thinking of things like the old Monkey Island remasters and Halo Combat Evolved's remaster. I absolutely loved it with those older remasters, and I absolutely love it in this remaster, and it's a shame that it was kind of phased out from remasters late in the 2010s. It just gives you a deeper appreciation for the artistic improvements when you're able to literally flick it on and off in an instant just to see how much every area in the game has been improved. There is also an updated soundtrack. Now, the general audio of the game hasn't been changed, such as the blaster sounds or the voices, but the soundtrack does have an improvement. This is one thing though where I can't give you a concrete answer as to how it's been improved. I don't know whether this is a brand new soundtrack made for the game, or if it's been upscaled in some way. I'm not much of a connoisseur when it comes to old school MIDIs and soundboards, and much like the visual tone, it's a nice upgraded balance of having it feel like it belongs in the game from the 90s, whilst feeling fresh in its own right, which to me is impressive. And finally, the Dark Forces remaster is filled with a bonus content section called the Vault. There's looks into the original game's development, the concept art, and most interestingly, there's a brand new level called the Avenger that's never been seen outside of a demo for the Consumer Electronics Show and some promotional imagery. And it is fully playable here, which is a really nice addition, as it's basically a brand new level for everybody. With that said though, I don't know if I'm being a bit greedy here, but I felt like the Vault was a little bit bare. I would have liked to have seen more about Night Dive's process of development, how they approached this remaster artistically, mechanically, maybe some interview with the developers and the artists, you know. I would have liked a deep dive into this game's history and the development, and instead the Vault is more like dipping your toe into the shallow end of a pool. But either way, this review is getting pretty lengthy, so to wrap it up, do I think the Dark Forces remaster is worth you buying? Absolutely. Whether you have played Dark Forces before, whether you grew up with it, or you are brand new and this is the first time, the Dark Forces Remaster is a holistically fantastic game that I think every Star Wars gaming fan should experience at least once in their life, and this is truly the best way you are ever going to experience Dark Forces, and it is a phenomenal entry into a legendary Star Wars gaming series. And I for one am really hopeful that Night Dive get the opportunity to tackle Dark Forces 2, which takes everything that Dark Forces did well and just takes it to the next level. Once again, I want to thank Night Dive for providing me a copy early, and the Star Wars Dark Forces Remaster is available now on every major platform. I really appreciate you getting this far into the review, and if you did enjoy it, please do hit the like button, it helps me out a great deal, and perhaps consider subscribing if you haven't to join my wonderful Star Wars community. And if you're interested in watching more from me, you should check this video out. It is 50 awesome, uninterrupted facts about the Sith Lord Darth Revan from Knights of the Old Republic. I'll see you there.